knew we were going to have to do that, which when we got a bid on it, it originally included replacing the water main. So now we're going to get it all done.
No choice.
Yeah. So, but the nice thing is they were, I learned a lot about plumbing really quickly, and okay, we're streaming. I should probably get it. I had always thought of a plumbing system as an in-out, right? Like water comes in and then it goes out, but it's not. It's two separate systems, just like airplanes. And, it's like you got your water and you've got your drainage. So my mind was blown when he hooked up. He ran a hose from the city line to one of our outdoor spigots, and that's our water intake right now. And it works. Water pressure isn't quite as great as it was, but we've got water, and that's good enough for me.
You're doing plumbing like at the bottom of my electrical. I saw the plumbing with leaks. You can put a diaper on a leak.
Yeah.
And it lasts like a month or
Oh, thank you.
You can put all this.
Yeah.
I have a lot of elbows where I put a diaper on.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, we had,
I really absorb it.
the neighbors told us we had a fountain going up in the air. We didn't even see it at that time. And oh my gosh, we got it right by our meter. But luckily it was on the county side.
Ah.
Thank goodness.
It was interesting to watch them. 2 days, 3 great big trucks.
Yes.
All they had to do is cut a hole this big.
Yeah.
And then was it a month later, here 3 trucks came to check it again. I mean, I'm not talking about pickups.
No, these are big.
Big, yeah.
Each employee has a big truck.
Yep.
All right. Oh, I didn't want to do that. That'll work. How's everybody doing? Good. So we'll start out today is I'll kind of give you the scope of what we're talking about, and then we'll start to get into the Gospel of Mark.
Do I need to go get Bibles?
Your what?
Do I need to go get Bibles? Is this a
Yeah, they wouldn't hurt. I'll you know what, I can run them both. Come on in.
Yeah. I'll help him. It's probably I'll get more.
Thank you, Gail. Yeah, well, yeah, that's true. All the pages still there? Okay, so the topic for the foreseeable future is context of the Gospels. We are going to actually read the Bible. It won't just be purely context, because what I want to do is, like, after we've talked about, why is it important that Mark was written when Mark was written? What we're going to do is we're actually going to look at different pieces of Mark. Number one, that kind of give us evidence, like this is why we know when it came from. But number two, how does it change, or how does it affect how we read Mark as opposed to reading Luke or reading Matthew or reading John? And by the time we get to John, right, again, it's my ongoing joke, which one of these things is not like the others? It's really apparent how different John is. And it's not just a narrative, right? So when we talk about the synoptic synoptic gospel versus John, right? Primarily what we're talking about is the synoptic gospels all follow the same narrative arc, okay? They include almost all of the same stories, and you can start, this is why there are things such as interlinears, right? Well, not interlinears. What are they called? Well, 3 of them are, I don't know the right word. Anyways, there are, and I'll describe it rather than try to come up with the name. There are books, there are gospels that you can get where it's got on one page One column is Mark, one column is Luke, and one column is Matthew. It's really cool to see because you can see Mark is the shortest, right? Mark is 16 chapters. Mark is really succinct. He's not super loquacious. And you can see, here's this Mark, Luke, Matthew. Matthew is the longest of the 4 Gospels at 26 chapters.
Does it make a difference in what order they were written?
It does. It does. Which we'll talk about here in just a second. It makes a difference because in many ways Luke and Matthew are based off of Mark. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But also, and this is the thing that we're really going to talk about, it's because what was going on for the community of Christians when these were being written. Okay, so let's start off first. We'll talk about what authorship means because this is, I think, where we get hung up the most. Okay, when I was in Sunday school, my operating assumption, and maybe this was taught to me, was that the disciple Matthew wrote Matthew, the disciple Mark wrote Mark, Luke, John, etc. And that was what I held for a number of years. I don't actually remember when that was challenged for the first time. I don't know, maybe it would have been in confirmation. Maybe it wasn't until seminary. I have no idea. But when we talk about the authorship of any of the 4 Gospels, we don't actually have a good answer for who wrote it, to be honest to you. Likely, it was not written. None of the 4 were written by one of the original disciples of Jesus. Okay, so the question is who were they named after, and why were they named after them? So were they actually? Was the Gospel of Matthew named after Matthew? That one likely yes. And one of the reasons that we kind of suspect that is because Matthew, according to tradition, was a tax collector, right? Matthew is a really interesting character to think about because Matthew being a tax collector brings a whole different perspective into the 12 disciples, right? And so as you read through Matthew, there is this repeated emphasis, or just, it pops up over and over, talking about tax collectors. Tax collectors are the people that Jesus met with. So this is one of the things that, yes, it's named after Matthew. One of the options that's available here is that Matthew, in some way, actually contributed to that narrative, right? So that maybe that gospel is based off of firsthand accounts of Matthew relating the stories of his experience of the story of Jesus. That is a distinct possibility. Same with Mark, same with John, same with Luke, right? Could be that these are based off of, potentially oral traditions that were handed down. Now, keep in mind when we're talking about the distance, the distance between the actual events and them being recorded down, it isn't actually that far, right? From a modern perspective. In our modern world, 50 years, that person might still be alive, right? Biographies are written. How many books have been written about World War II accounts, potentially in the last 5, 10, 20 years with firsthand accounts, right? We're losing our World War II survivors, pretty quickly. There won't be any more of those folks around, like we've already lost our World War I survivors. But it's pretty fantastic that 70 years removed from those events, we can really validate the authenticity of those experiences. Okay, but we live in a world, right, with the written word being easily accessible, data storage being easily done, even prior to the computer era, right? We had great ways of archiving information. One of the things that's always shocking to me, my dad's older sister Linda is the family genealogist, and what's mind-blowing to me is how much information she's able to discover from hundreds of years ago. For example, it is now pretty much confirmed that one of my great-great-great-great-great-grand-somethings was a murderer. Yeah, he was convicted of murder in Oslo and sentenced to prison, from which he escaped and then was killed not long after.
Maybe he didn't really do it.
It'd be a great story, wouldn't it? I don't know.
Linda's related to Lizzie Borden.
No way.
Yeah, she's like a 4th cousin 3 times removed.
That says a lot, doesn't it?
What you wanted to do.
That's
Is that how he got his leg?
that is great. I love that. But we take for granted the ability to store information, right? Imagine the situation in first century Israel, right? Just right from the basics, the actual means of communication of information was limited, expensive, and didn't last a long time, right?
Well, a lot of people didn't have writing abilities.
No, I mean, yeah, I don't even know what an estimated literacy rate would have been for. I mean, and this is why you have people like scribes, whose literal job was to know how to read and to be able to duplicate written works. Betty.
You know, I've been into genealogy for years, and they call us the get smart too late bunch of people. But just something that's really important for all of you guys, pass on what you know.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and I always wish that we had I had great grandparents when we had 3 kids, when they were my great grandparents, and things they told me, and I've tried to write them down, you know, because where's it going to be? That kind of information isn't going to be anyplace.
And yeah,
except in your brain.
And never underestimate how meaningful it will be for
and
your,
so a lot of that's been passed
you know,
down.
for your children and
Bible.
grandchildren.
I
Yeah.
have a friend, and I've taken on this, where she's even pieces that are handed down through the family, like furniture pieces that are really special, put on the bottom of them where it came from, what's the history of it, because
that would be
the
amazing.
kids don't, I mean, they are interested, but I grew up in a family where extended family was there. And we sat and listened to my grandmother. It was the dearest part of our dinners with her. Right. Was listening to things they used to do. And even my sisters who are younger will say, how do you remember that?
Yeah.
Because they were too little to really take it in.
And there's an age where you begin to develop a curiosity for that stuff, and it's tragically too late.
Well, and then there's some people that say, you know how it is, you know, the old story of telephone where the game you can play where then it gets stretched and the story isn't even the same. But I think people were more acute to oral history.
Yes.
When that was the only way.
That is absolutely true. And that's something that I want to reinforce here. But also that's something that we need to understand just with regards to how our Bible develops as a document, right? Is that we're talking Old Testament. Almost all of it originates as oral history, right? Until it becomes written history. And it has to do with a lot of the same reasons of, the development of Hebrew as a spoken and written language is mind-blowing and fascinating just in that regard. And I have to watch myself, otherwise I'll go off on this, because I find this stuff absolutely fascinating. But Hebrew developed from Syro-Phoenician, one of the first actual alphabetic languages, right? So we're past the stage of hieroglyphics, where a symbol represents a sound as opposed to representing a whole idea, right? And the flexibility that gives, because one of the problems with hieroglyphics is you have to invent a new one for every new idea, which, if you think about it, limits your new ideas, right? Because your language only supports existing ideas. If you have a language that's based on sound, it's super easy to create new words, which we're experiencing in real time, right? I can't understand anybody under the age of 20. 20 to 27-year-olds, I can understand maybe 20%. No, I'm being snarky, but yeah, I mean, language is a fascinating thing. So it's really important to understand how big of a role oral tradition played in the development of the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, because most likely all of what becomes, each of these 4 Gospels, not even talking about the non-canonical Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter or any of those, almost assuredly all of those began as oral traditions, right? Because it's very likely that only maybe 1 or 2 of the disciples knew how to write. Judas did. He was the bookkeeper. Likely Matthew did, and maybe Luke. Luke, we don't know. Luke is often attributed as being a physician and being Greek trained, right? So he would have been literate. But Peter certainly wasn't. Peter, James, and John, the fishermen. Nope, they were illiterate. Did they learn later in life? Maybe they did. Paul, you're talking about. Paul was literate, but Paul was trained in the Jewish temple, right? Jesus likely could write. He was, and this is more conjecture than anything. but based on what we know about Jesus, he was likely rabbinically trained, which would have probably included the ability to read and write. But scribes were highly valued, right? The ability to duplicate and retain information. You know, we run a document through a copy machine, right? That's how easy it is to produce stuff. But in that day, so I was mentioning the Book of Kells, 3 weeks ago. That's what's so fascinating about some of these Bibles that predate the printing press is the intense amount of labor that went into creating these what become works of art. Also, and sorry, this is yet another tangent, but this is also why the Gutenberg printing press is so stinking fascinating, and really is on par with any technological development in the history of humanity as being more effective.
Those of us sitting here know a lot more about printing
Yeah.
Things.
Yeah.
I think when I taught school, typing on a typewriter and then putting it through a mimeograph.
I will say though, I took a typing class in 8th grade, and it was on a typewriter.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, I was probably the last.
But the mimeograph took it.
Yeah, I never.
When they finally came up with being able to reproduce things for the classroom teacher, it was
Made your life, yeah.
Oh. Yeah.
And then there was this whole class of teachers who thrived on overhead projectors. Which, oh my gosh, I had a professor in my undergrad who was miserable to take notes from. He was from the Indian subcontinent, had a pretty strong accent, and talked really fast. And so he would be lecturing on one thing and writing stuff on the overhead projector, and he had awful handwriting. And he would write over himself. He'd smear it with his hand. I miraculously got a B in that class.
It is amazing to me back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because of the education at that time, people, men and women, had beautiful handwriting.
Yes.
And since the 50s, it has gone down. I mean, now they don't even teach.
They don't teach penmanship anymore.
Yeah.
I used to have beautiful handwriting. I don't write enough anymore.
My mother had
Even-
beautiful handwriting,
yeah.
even though she was forced to write right-handed, and
Yeah.
she was left-handed.
Sometimes I wonder if that's better, because good Lord, writing as a lefty, smearing your ink how many times a pain in the butt. We all develop these cramped writing styles to compensate. Yeah.
But things on record, and then I won't say more about genealogy.
Oh, it's okay.
I sent $20 to the church in Germany
Yeah.
and got back for Marlon's family to 1720. If you had all the grandparents that they traced one back to, there'd be 340 different grandparents.
That's awesome.
And then I sent them a little bit of money later because I wanted to find out about you're supposed to go get it changed into German, and I just put a $20 bill in there. But the churches. That's where you get your information.
Churches are the record keepers of history.
And 50 years from now, I hope our churches
yeah.
get information.
I mean, it's a two-edged sword in that history. This perspective on history has mainly been recorded through the lens of the Catholic Church. But I mean, the reason that we know what happened, fall of the Western Roman Empire, is pretty much due to the Catholic Church. Yeah. Otherwise,
Send on that, they'll even find out what those grandparents. They were always a master farmer.
Yeah.
Or a master shoemaker. They're
yeah.
always master. Anyway,
Not just
it's interesting to get that from the church.
Would there have been bias in that?
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, this is something. But you got to keep in mind, bias really has. Bias has been assumed for most of human history, right? I mean, there's the thing, history is written by the victors. Well, yeah, of course, right? I'll make this a short tangent. This is why the Kings and Chronicles accounts are so important to the Hebrew people, because it narrates the fall of their kingdom from their perspective, right? It's absolutely biased, 100% biased. It's written after the fact. Both of those narratives, Kings and Chronicles, are written post-exile, right? But it's really important to the Hebrew people because it's not the history that has been written by the Babylonians or the Assyrians, not the Persians, but So in their own words, they're describing why they ended up where they're at, But yes, it's bias Absolutely, the victors tell history. Okay.
Jesse, just as an
Go for
offshoot,
it.
I'm going to do a squirrel. You know how they say a dead clock is at least
Right, 2 times a day.
time. Well, right now it's right. It's dead. It's dead, but it's right.
been that for 2 weeks.
I don't know. Maybe it's just because we're not in here enough, but it seems like clock batteries are dying at an alarming rate. Sorry. Myself and the facts. Okay.
That was good.
Thank you. I didn't realize the pun I was making until I was halfway through it. So how did we get our Gospels? Okay, we already talked about it. Oral traditions, absolutely, hugely important. One of the other pieces that many scholars advocate for is that, and this makes a lot of sense if you actually look at the composition of our Gospels, is that individual miracle accounts would have had written accounts of them, right? So like all of, especially in Matthew, right, all of these different healings and different things that occurred likely may have been compiled, right, to form Matthew's account, right? In other words, somebody wrote down that they heard, that they were there when they saw this thing happen, that Jesus healed in this way, right? Those likely would have been edited, and when I say edited, I don't mean I don't mean the content change, but maybe the voice, the perspective, because in Matthew it's all, well, in any of the Gospels it's all third person account, okay. And then kind of the most important, they're all important, is what we refer to as Proto Gospels, okay. So
Referred to as what?
Proto Gospels. So before we get Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there are attempts, not even attempts, there are Gospels, but not in a fully fleshed out form, okay? So it might have been an accounting of the Galilean narrative. It might have been an accounting of the crucifixion narrative, okay? But there are writings that almost certainly existed, right, which predate the four that we have. And so the way I learned it, which it has changed quite a bit, even which you wouldn't think 2,000 years later, this kind of science changes at the rate that it does. But even from when I was in seminary, how we talk about the origin of the Gospels have changed quite a bit. So when I was in seminary, what I was taught was there's the Q source, and then there's Mark comes after the Q source, and then Luke and Matthew use bits of the Q source and bits of Mark. And then John does his own thing. Now what they're talking about is that Mark and the Q source probably developed alongside one another, and then Matthew and Luke are pulling from all three of those.
So what is Q source referred to?
So Q source is a proposed proto-gospel that we don't have copies of, okay? And the reason that we that we know that a Q source exists is because if you go in comparative, with the Gospels side by side, there is stuff that's in Matthew and Mark, or Matthew and Luke, that isn't in Mark. So where did it come from? So if there are stories there, and Matthew and Luke are written about the same time, okay, where were they getting their information from? And so it has been proposed and is pretty much widely accepted, is that there is a proto-gospel that existed from which no copies, survived to modernity, that was widely circulated, which the gospel authors of Matthew and Luke, and potentially John, used as a framework, okay? So if you look at, I'll print this off at some point, that you can actually see percentages of for Matthew and Luke, how much it's composed of what. So Luke and Matthew each are about 40 to 45% composed of Mark, okay? Both Matthew and Luke have about a third, 20% to a third, that is unique. So for example, for Luke, it's 40% Mark, about 35% that's unique to Luke. And then there is the rest, which is, where did that come from, okay? Matthew is, similar but different. So the long story short, essentially what we're talking about is that Mark is one of the earliest accounts, and we're gonna transition to Mark in a second. But there was this other one out there that unfortunately did not survive past that era that existed, that was used as an authoritative source. And it wasn't just a source; it was a gospel account in its own right, that was used by the early Christians that didn't make it out.
And probably destroyed by the Jews at the time.
May have been, or maybe we just got unlucky and none of the copies survived. Or when Matthew and Luke are written, nobody circulated it anymore, right? Because it got absorbed by these two. Which, in a lot of ways, you could argue that actually gives credence to the synoptics, because it says that, yeah, there may have been earlier accounts that existed, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke were seen consistent with these earlier accounts enough that they replaced the Proto Gospels that existed. Does that make sense what I'm saying there? Yeah, right? It's like you could even think about it in terms of textbooks have the 19th edition, right? Which replaces the 18 that had gone before them because there's constantly new information being added on, right? But even that textbook supplanted an earlier textbook, right? This drives teachers nuts, right? Every time they have to redo their curriculum because there's a new math textbook that came out. But if you go back, those previous textbooks, were valid in their own right, but they were supplanted by.
I can't resist a squirrel.
Yeah,
and you
please.
being a media source. Was there a Q character in Star Trek?
Yes, there was. He was like the
Is
genie.
there a connection
Yeah,
where
yeah.
it came from? Anyway, just don't need to
Where did they come up with Q? Because I remember
Oh, that's a good question.
North Clackamas did a Q sort when we were figuring out curriculum when it first unified, and I remember doing it and remember thinking it was horrible, but because it was laborious. But where does that come from?
I don't actually know. I don't know if they just picked a random variable to represent it.
SORT, not source.
Yeah, no. Yeah, and why is it Q anon? I don't know. Yeah, they have nothing to do with each other, I promise you that. That's an interesting. I'll look that up. I'll have an answer for you for next week.
What she just said, there's a new commercial for an investment group called QQQ.
I don't know if
I wouldn't go there.
I wouldn't go there either. For fear it's connected with something else.
Let's try it here. Hold on one sec. Why is it called the Q source?
Whoever wrote Final of Matthew just like briefer things? I mean, there are people that will tell the same story and just be less.
Sorry, repeat that again.
I'm just wondering if Matthew could have been finally put into form because the person that finally wrote it down thought in terms of briefer terms.
Could be.
Writers.
And this is, especially with. This is something I wish I had been given permission to think about earlier on in my life. Is that I think it's really fun to imagine, why the Gospels evolved in the way that they did, right? I remember having so much anxiety around. Well, if there's 4 different Gospels, does that mean that they're not true, right? Who was right? And they contradict each other. What's that about? But man, alive, more and more, I'm just like, it's amazing that we have anything. It's amazing that we have any accountings of this, considering the circumstances, which is what we're going to talk about. Okay, I did a Google because why is it called the Q source? It's really disappointing. It's really disappointing, actually. It's from German. Of course, it's the German. It's always the Germans, but it's from Quelle, Quelle, which means source. So it's literally the source.
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 So we did a source sort.
Voila.
Okay. Curriculum.
Okay, so that's how these Gospels developed. Let's talk about when they developed, and then we'll spend our last 15 or 20 minutes or so talking about Mark. Mark is the earliest, okay, and Mark we can pinpoint to a 10-year range. Was written sometime between CE, Common Era 66 and 70, which we'll get to. Okay, that one we're pretty. Mark is the one we're most pretty sure about for interesting reasons. Luke and Matthew, geez Louise, are written later. Generally speaking, we are pretty confident sometime around the 9th and 10th century Common Era. So somewhere between 80, or not decade, not century, sorry. Sometime between 80 and 90, or 80 and 95 Common Era. That's when Matthew and Luke. And Matthew and Luke kind of come out of the same stuff. John is the youngest child. Again, which one of these things is not like the others? John, we can really have a hard time pinpointing. Could be as early as 90, could be as late as 110, when John was written.
What confuses me is that there are different Johns in the Bible.
Yeah, confuses everybody.
So which one is which? I mean,
Generally held that there are up to 3 Johns. What's that?
Do they think some guy named John did Mark?
Oh, I don't know about that. No, sorry. So here are the John sources that we have. We have the letters of John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. We have the Gospel of John, and we have Revelation, written by John of Patmos. Okay. I have seen arguments that John of Patmos was responsible for the letters and Revelation. I have heard arguments that John the Gospel writer is responsible for John the Gospel and the letters of John. Nobody argues that John the Gospel wrote Revelation. Okay. And then I've heard arguments that all 3 are written by 3 different people. I've heard arguments that the letters of John are written by different people as well too. And the way that scholars do this work of kind of like imagining who wrote this is based on two major things. One is historical references. Okay, so that's kind of how we date things. Which again we'll talk about with regards to Mark. Is if in a letter they make reference to such and such an emperor, well, that's pretty easy to date then. This guy existed. He was in charge of Rome between these years. That's when it was written. In terms of authorship, it's writing styles. Okay. For example, I didn't talk about it in the sermon today, but it was on my mind. The Gospel of John has 21 chapters. Some argue that the true ending of the Gospel of John is the 20th chapter, and that 21 was an editorial that was added on later, because the end of chapter 20, which we read today, ends with, "In this book were written many signs that were given so that all may believe," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That sounds like an ending to a book, right? And then all of a sudden we skip ahead and we've got this whole thing that's about Peter. Where did that come from? And then then they alternate it. And one of the things that proponents for that idea point to is that the writing shifts subtly between 20 and 21. I don't know. That is something that I think people are more split on. The one that people are relatively sure about is the ending of Mark. Okay, is that Mark has an editorial ending. Okay, and if you actually flip to the Gospel of Mark, flip to chapter 16, you will see it. Mark comes after Matthew.
They can put that on the computer, the older texts, and decide whether they were written by the same person. Isn't that true?
Yeah.
Because of the way
Oh yeah.
the verbiage goes.
Oh,
Forensics does that.
forensic. Yeah, forensic, not etymology. Forensic. Oh, there's a word for it. It's not forensic linguistics. Anyways, that's an absolutely fascinating field. So look, if you've got one of these American Bible Society NRSVs, it literally says the shorter ending of Mark, right? And then the longer ending of Mark. And it's commonly held that the shorter ending of Mark is the original ending, and then it made people uncomfortable, and it was editorially added the longer ending. Because the shorter ending ends with the women fleeing from the tomb. That's it, right? The longer ending tacks on Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene. Right? That's a much more comfortable ending. Okay, written by somebody else. At some point in the history of the Gospel of Mark, somebody tacked that on, and it stuck. Right? But we can go back and look at the language. The verbiage changes. A bunch of reasons as to why we are pretty confident that was added on. Okay.
so Mark is more to the point, get on with it.
So let's talk about let's talk about Mark. And we'll really get into it next week, but we're going to lay the groundwork today. See you, Judy. Let's talk about Mark. So Mark, I already mentioned, shortest of the four. It's only 16 chapters long. Mark is very succinct, right? So Matthew, to a certain extent, John especially, right, and the other three Gospels, you get a little bit more description, but you also get a little bit more kind of like editorial content, right? Like things that are happening outside the event. Whereas Mark almost 100% consistently sticks to what's going on in that moment, right? Where John is the worst, in my opinion. Worst being an interesting word choice, I suppose. But John, all the time, you get, well, for example, and he said this so that they might know that he was, blah, blah, blah. Like, we've got fourth wall breaking, the author telling us exactly why Jesus is doing what he's doing. Like, how do you know? Did he tell you? Right? I don't need to know that. I don't want to know that. You're ruining the story for me, man. Mark, you get none of that. In fact, you barely get setting in Mark, which is one of the struggles, reading through Mark as compared to reading through Matthew and Luke, is that Mark doesn't really often give you description as to where and when these things are occurring. There's a lot, in Mark, we often joke, it's a lot of and then, so that, right? He bumps you right to the next thing, doesn't even let you take a breath. And so it really feels like you're rushing through the narrative in a lot of ways. Immediately after, that's the phrase I was looking for.
It's the crib notes.
Yes. Well, yeah, I don't know. And it could have just been a writing style. And it could have been, this is a fun thing to imagine, that Mark really truly was a compilation of miracle accounts, right? And so all the author of Mark did was take these existing accounts, smack them together and say, here you go. Here's the narrative. Here's a rough timeline based on some research. I'm not going to add a lot in here. I'm just giving you the story as I've compiled it, right? It's really, really fun to think about. So Mark, written sometime between 65 and 70 AD. How do we know this? We know this because of the First Jewish-Roman War. Okay, Mark and all the Gospels have a story in them wherein Jesus points to the temple and says, "This temple will be torn down in 3 days and built back, built back up." Now we theologize it. We say, well, he's actually talking about his body. But, and then I suppose you could debate this a little bit, but almost everybody will tell you that this is evidence that the author that wrote this narrative knew that the temple was going to be torn down, had experienced it. When was the temple torn down? During the First Jewish-Roman War, okay? Wherein, right, Masada, right, we got the great story of the 980-some Jewish soldiers that commit suicide rather than succumb to the Roman forces besieging Masada, right? So this is an 8-year spanning war in which the Jews revolt against the Roman occupiers, because of which the Romans level burned down the temple and all that comprises it. Okay, and Masada being a fascinating I really wanted to see it, but this was when we were in Israel. It rained torrentially for like 3 days, and the roads to Masada and the Dead Sea washed out, and I didn't get to go. That was the one thing I wanted to see, man. I really wanted to see Masada. It's awesome. If you've ever seen aerial pictures of it, and the story behind it is just, from the Roman perspective, is fascinating. This showcases the determination of the Roman armies. It's up on top of a mesa, right, and it's built out of stone, and there is no way to get up there except for this one tiny road. So these Jewish revolutionaries hole up on the top of this, and there's no way that the Romans can get up there in force to get them out of there. It's simply impossible. So what do the Romans do? They build a freaking road up there. They literally pile up stone and dirt to make a ramp that their legions can march up. They're like, why are we going to throw people at the walls and we'll just build a bigger road? And so before the road ends up getting completed, they all off themselves. Poison, I think it was. How they do that. Or no, it wasn't. It was. There's many theories about whether they each killed themselves or whether they killed each other or whatever. Anyways. So this is how, we determine that Mark is written sometime between in this era, because, we can point and say, this is included in the narrative, this is happening. So here, right off the bat, is a really interesting thing to think about, is if you're reading Mark, written during this great crisis in the land of Israel, right, during this pretty violent war, does that work its way into Mark somehow, right? Is the gospel author at all influenced by current day events? Are they affecting what he's writing, right? Is potentially his impetus or her impetus to create this, at that time, authoritative account of the life of Jesus? Is the impetus perhaps the threat of violence of the war that's going on around them? It's a really interesting thing to wonder about, right? So how does that knowledge change how we read, the narrative account that exists there? Another interesting piece, and this is maybe a tangent, this is maybe a squirrel. So Flavius Josephus, who you may or may not have heard of. Josephus is one of the most well-known Jewish historians from this era, and he's pointed to a lot because Josephus seemingly affirms the existence of Jesus of Nazareth. So Josephus makes reference to Jesus of Nazareth. He was an historian who was Jewish, but was respected enough by the Romans that he worked hand in hand. However, when the Jewish-Roman War happens, he joins the side of the Jews, is actually placed in charge of this grand army that's supposed to go and face the Romans who are coming down from Lebanon, and they surrender before a blade is even drawn because they're so vastly outnumbered. So Josephus lives to write another day. But Josephus is one that we point to as well, too, as being kind of a source or an authority as to what's going on. So that's just a bit of a tangent, but it's, you'll hear his name pop up over and over and over again. Where was I? Okay, 10 after. Let's just talk about, real quickly, and then I'll get us out of here. Let's just talk really quickly about the narrative arc of Mark. Does anybody remember? You can look if you want. How does Mark start? What's the first story?
Beginning of the good news of Jesus.
Oh, John the Baptist.
Yeah, John the Baptist.
Boom.
Yeah.
Mark begins with the baptism of Jesus, ends, obviously, with his death. So here's an interesting thing about Mark, contrasted with any of the other Gospels. We have no narrative that isn't Jesus as an adult. There's no birth narrative, right? There's no youth narrative. There really isn't a youth narrative anyways. But we have nothing until Jesus pops on the scene being baptized. So literally, all we see as a picture of Jesus is Jesus as Messiah, right? Which gives different flavor in and of itself to Luke and Matthew, because Luke and Matthew are in many ways more humanizing of Jesus, because we get infant narratives. In Luke, we get the whole Elizabeth Mary interaction. In John, we get the wedding at Cana, right? No woman, that was not my time. Do what he says. This great interaction between Jesus and Mary. We get none of that. First story we get is Jesus getting baptized in the River Jordan, led into the wilderness to being tempted, and then kicks off his ministry. And again, that in and of itself says something about the goal of the author in this case, right? So there are a couple of options here. One option is that they simply didn't have any accounts from before that, right? So no, they didn't have any stories of Jesus preaching in the temple or teaching in the temple. They didn't have the stories of the flight to Egypt and all that jazz. That's an option. The other option is that they didn't see them relevant to what they were communicating, right? That what they thought was most important to tell was a story of Jesus' ministry that really is all that it is, right? Unlike Matthew and Luke, right? We don't get a post-resurrection narrative, We don't even really get a resurrection narrative if we're being honest. All we get is Jesus being baptized up to Jesus being killed. That's it. So something to think about is that for that gospel author, that was the stuff that was most important to them. And then at some point, arguably 20 years later, some other folks come on the scene and say, hey, you know what? We should probably include these other stories, okay? And again, we don't really have evidence to why this happens. This is the stuff where we just get to imagine, right? We get to wonder. So, again, perhaps the authors of Luke and Matthew went and did some more research. Maybe they tracked down people that were there for Jesus' birth. Maybe they tracked down the disciples, who experienced the resurrection narrative. Here's another piece: is Paul is very active during these years, and Paul is a second degree disciple. In that Paul was not one of the original 12; he would not have been there for the resurrection narrative. However, Paul knew Peter, knew James, knew John, would have had direct communication. So for Matthew and Luke, have Paul as a direct source of information, which could have been a major contributor to the post-resurrection narratives, especially. Okay. Also, it could point to the fact that our theology surrounding Jesus has developed significantly in the 20 years. Because this is for me kind of one of the most interesting things to think about is what did a Christian in Common Era 66 believe about Jesus? Right? We've had 2,000 years to develop this theology of forgiveness and resurrection and sin and all of these things. Okay, what did somebody who quote unquote believed and trusted in Jesus, what did they hold to be informative in Common Era 66? Obviously, there were things that were powerful to them, right? Obviously, there was something that's written in the Gospel of Mark that was so powerful, right, that they compiled this narrative during one of the roughest times of Jewish life. And all of the Christians at this point in time were probably, well, not all of them, most of them were Jews, okay? This is what marks a big shift by the time we get to the Gospel of John, is that up through the Gospel of Matthew, Christians are mostly Jewish people who have seen Jesus as Messiah, okay? Between Paul's adventures and the Gospel of John being written is when it expands beyond the Jewish community, it expands into the Gentile community. This is why the epistles are so important, right? It's because Romans, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, Philippians, these all tell the story of how Christianity expands beyond Judaism, okay? John is the gospel that shows us what that looks like, okay? So by the time we arrive at the Gospel of John, Christianity has become something different. It is no longer Jews following Jesus. It is now people, both Jews and Gentiles, who have become something other, right? They have become Christians, whatever that means. And we'll come back around to this again when we start talking about John. But what's cool about John is the introduction of imagery, right? Because if you can't be, you're no longer Jew nor Greek, no longer slave nor free, right? You're something different. That means you need to leave behind a lot of the luggage that you brought in, right? Because the imagery that's important to the Jews is not going to be important to the Gentiles and vice versa. And so what we get in John is a development of the Lamb who was slain. I am the true vine. I am the water of life, right? None of this stuff exists in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because in John, you need that language. So, okay, this is what I'll wrap up with today. I'll try to bring it back to Mark. So, in John, you get stuff that is injected into the gospel narrative because it was important to the worshiping community of Christians, right? So John is written by people who have become something different. Mark is written by people who are still Jewish. And what's going on for the Jewish people at this time is that they are in a running battle with Rome surrounding their perceived independence. And just think about how profound it is that in the midst of all this, and we'll get to this in Mark, is this narrative that says it's not important, right? We are not here about our oppression to Rome. That is not what God is most concerned about. That is not what Jesus died for. Jesus didn't die because of Rome. Jesus died for us, for the world, right? So in other words, Rome is on everybody's mind right now, but that's not what is most important. That's not what Jesus is about. It's really kind of a gutsy thing to announce in the midst of all that's going on. You know?
When you say change in images, can one say becoming more mystical? Between the...
Absolutely.
Okay.
and that's more John.
Quote.
That's more John.
Right.
And you could use the word mystical. I would even advocate that by the time you get to John, you have all new language, all new spiritual language. The Jesus of Mark is very much orthopraxic, right? Like, this is what I'm doing. I'm healing people. I'm teaching about these things, right? But mainly healing people, right? It's all about action. We don't really get a Sermon on the Mount. We don't get a Sermon on the Mount in Mark, right? It isn't until we get to Matthew that we get all of this monologue and teaching by Jesus that's included in it. We don't really get that in Mark. We get parables, right? But that's about it. Yeah, it's pretty cool. All right, I'm exhausted. I'm sure you're exhausted. I'm sure everyone, yeah. Okay, so for next week, we'll begin to dig into Mark. So I'm gonna this week put together maybe 3 or 5 passages that we can kind of look at, or maybe 1 or 2. 3 or 5 might be too much, but it will be beginning to look at passages that may in some way reflect the setting of that time, if that makes sense. Cool. See you next week.